Welcome again to this episode of the Healing from Lyme Summit. I'm joined today by Dr. Alexis Chesni, and Dr. Chesni is a fellow naturopathic doctor, acupuncturist, educator, author. She's actually written a great book called Preventing Lyme and Other Tick-Borne Diseases, Control Ticks in the Home Landscape, Prevent Infection Using Herbal Protocols, and Treat Tick Bites with Natural Remedies. So Dr. Chesni, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, we talk so much in the summit about different aspects of Lyme. A lot of it's focused on treatment and gut and everything else. But I think the one thing we haven't really talked about is prevention. And I mean, you and I both learned this very early in medical school that prevention is the best medicine. If we can prevent people from getting Lyme in the first place, and I know so many people who are tuning in, they've already been infected, they've passed that. But I see so many people in my practice, and I'm sure you do too, that once they get exposed to Lyme, they never want to go out in Mother Nature again. They don't want to garden anymore. They don't want to hike. They don't want to camp, and rightfully so. But there's so many health benefits of being out in Mother Nature. I'd hate to preclude anyone from ever experiencing it again. So I know you wrote this fabulous book on different prevention strategies, and I want to walk people through, what can people do to be able to enjoy being out in the world without having as much fear about getting reinfected again. So, let's start maybe with just being around the home. What are some things that people can do maybe outside of their home to prevent ticks?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm so glad that we can talk about prevention. I too, what got me started with writing the book was that I would see patients come back after healing from Lyme, or a tick-borne disease the first time, having another tick bite and acute Lyme again. And it just, I would increase the length of my handout to hand to them and talk about all these different methods. And so that's where the book came from. So I really hope that, my mission is to end Lyme through prevention. So, so thank you for having me. So back to your question. Sorry, what was your question again?
Yeah, so I want to start like the outside of the home.
Outside of the house, exactly.
I know, like from a conventional standpoint, you can call pesticide companies that come out and spray usually pyrethroids or other types of chemicals, which can have their own potential toxic effects. I don't know, I mean, I lived in Connecticut for almost 20 years, and most of the people I knew, neighbors and patients, were spraying their yards on a regular basis. But, these chemicals stay in the ground for a long time. They can be potentially toxic to children and pets. And I don't know that that's the best strategy. So what are some of the things that you recommend for people to do outside the home that can help prevent ticks?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thinking about the landscape, thinking about just the geography of where you live, right? So trying to do some simple things like keeping the leaves raked and debris out of the yard, not having something like a swing set or a garden that you're in all the time at the edge of a yard that abuts a forest, because it's really in that transition area where we see more ticks. Keeping the grass cut low is not going to prevent ticks from being there, but it will help. Also thinking about places of moisture and shade. Those are going to be places that ticks like to be in. So just being mindful, like what habitat do ticks like, and how can I decrease either creating that habitat for them or avoid going into that habitat or be protected when I go into that habitat. There's a natural substance made by cedar side using cedar oil, or I'm sure there are other companies as well. And you can actually use that and spray that on your lawn and your garden, and that's very safe, but it does repel ticks. You do have to do it frequently, but it can make an impact. Also, some companies do use some essential oils that, like you were mentioning, some companies that might use pyrethroids. Some of them, if you ask, will use some essential oils. And I have some patients come, have the company come 3 times a year, spring, summer, beginning of fall, and that can make an impact as well. And then there are tick tubes, which I really love. And I've seen some great responses from my patients and learning about them and making them and putting them out in their yards.
Yeah, I know it's a pretty simple process. Can you actually just tell people how to make a tick tube? It really is super simple.
Yeah. You could totally buy them, but it's a good project if you want and to save money. And you could even do part of it with your kids and make it a project at home together. So what you do is you save dryer lint or other materials like that, and then save paper towel or toilet tissue tubes. You can also use PVC and use other substances as well. But so we want to create these tubes that have a material in it that are going to be attractive to mice. And so what we do is we stuff those tubes with permethrin treated materials like cotton balls or the lint that you've saved. So of course, when using permethrin, you need to be very careful. So you go outside, choose to wear gloves, get permethrin, 0.5% permethrin is the best to use, and spread out your materials, spray them down. Takes about an hour or two to dry, depending on the humidity. And then you can come back, and when it's dried, it's safe to touch, or you could still wear your gloves, and stuff the materials into the tubes, and then just leave a little bit of emptiness on each side, keeping it packed in the middle. And then what you do is you go out into your yard and find areas that mice like to be in. So like if you have a stone wall, they love that. You can tuck them in there. Around a shed, or like I said, that transition phase from the yard, the grass, to the woods. Different places like that would be great. And there's there's certain amount that you need per square foot. And then we see the impact of that decrease in ticks in the yard. And so what will happen is it'll be, this tube with the materials will be out in the landscape, and the mouse will come along, bring some of that material back to its nest. And because it's treated with permethrin, it won't hurt the mouse, whether you are happy about that or not. People always ask that. But it will kill the ticks on that mouse and the family of mice. So it's really effective in that way. Yeah, so I've seen great things with patients reporting back, a major decline in tick bites in the family after putting that into play. And that I also recommend 3 times a year. Some people recommend twice a year, but I just think about that time, like, that bookmark of the spring and the fall for that increase in ticks, and trying to catch that. And then also just throwing in another time during the summer.
Yeah, I love the tick tube idea. Again, it's so simple, it's so easy. And again, I used to do this when I lived in Connecticut. Again, I would just save the old toilet paper rolls because they're easy, they're disposable. The only thing I didn't like is if it rained, it got kind of messy and sloppy. But again, grab gloves, throw it out. But I like the fact it's disposable versus like a PVC tube that you kind of have to clean out and then put new stuff in. But it's kind of whatever works. And again, super simple, super easy, but again, can be very effective. Where my house was in Connecticut, again, I was surrounded by tons of trees. I had a brick wall in the back of my property, and I had a neighbor adjacent to me that used to pile all his junk, all his branches and leaves, and he just wouldn't clean it up. So I was very conscientious about, again, putting it, like I said, in those transition areas. And I got bit before I owned this house. I never got bit after the fact, so it seemed to have worked. But again, I think people maybe misunderstand sometimes, because they hear about deer ticks and they think that the deer are the bigger spreader of these ticks. And in reality, it's not the deer, it's the rodents, right? It's like the mice and the rat and the other furry little creatures. So again, the tick tubes can just be a very inexpensive, easy way to help, potentially reduce that tick population in and around your yard. And I also used to use garlic oil. You mentioned cedar oil, and I found garlic oil also seemed to work pretty well. And again, it's safe for pets, kids, plants. And I would just get a concentrated garlic oil. I got one of those big spray containers, and you fill it up with water, and then just walk around the property, spray around the the perimeter of the house, and your plants, and then just kind of work your way out. And I found that it would last about 6 weeks or so. And then I would have to reapply. But again, it was relatively inexpensive and pretty easy to do. So again, it's nice that we've got these strategies that we can use outdoors to hopefully help preventing you getting a tick bite. And certainly I worry about pets too, right? Because, especially with dogs, or if you've got outdoor cats, they go outside to do their business, or cats especially, that who knows where they go when they're outside the home. They're at a much higher risk because they're low to the ground, they're brushing against, foliage. And, I'm kind of convinced when I got Lyme that I got it from my dog, because I had a dog that was a little tiny 5.5 pound Maltese that would sit on my lap and sleep with
Mhm.
me at night. And, I wasn't much of an outdoor person, but boy, if it gets on a pet, especially like a dog with long hair, those ticks would be very, very difficult to find, if not impossible. And then if they're on you, it'd be very easy for that tick to move from the pet to you. So this is also a good strategy, not just for you, but for your pets as well.
Yeah, and it's been found that pet owners are twice as likely to get a tick bite than non-pet owners. So yeah, and I hear that all the time. And when I had a dog that went out, it's just constant checking. Things you can do though for pets is like with a dog, get a little permethrin treated dog shirt or a bandana, because sometimes the sniffing around, they'll
Yeah.
get them coming up their face. You can also use the cedar side. The dog needs to be more than 20 pounds, and not to use the cedar oil on a cat. But for dogs, it can work for those bigger dogs.
I'm curious. I know you talk about this book in your book, but what about plants, shrubs? Are there things that we can put around the house that are naturally tick repellents?
Not that I know of. That's a good question. Yeah. I think about deer repellent plants. And like you said, of course, it's important to note that it's not just the deer bringing in the black-legged ticks to the yard, but also the mice and other animals. But, that's one thing that comes up regarding that. But that's a good question.
So plants that are deer repellent, are there specific things that you recommend?
That is very, now that I've relocated, I'm not thinking of an example. It's very dependent on the climate of the area. Yeah, and there are great resources out there for sure on that.
Okay. And I'll defer back to your book too, because I know you did have a list in here as I was reading through it
Yes,
on
yes,
different
there
plants. And there
is.
was a
There
lot of
is.
them. So I hate to put you on the spot because I know trying to memorize like 40 different plants isn't practical, but definitely check out Dr. Chesney's book for that list of plants. And again, if you're thinking about, re-landscaping, or you want to add other things, particularly if you do live in an area where there are a lot of deer, may not keep the ticks out per se, but if you can reduce the deer population, that's just another vector that might be bringing these ticks, in and around your yard.
Absolutely.
Um, let's talk a little bit about preventing ticks on you. If you do decide you want to be outdoors, you want to enjoy Mother Nature, what are some things that people can do to help keep ticks getting on them personally?
Yeah, so definitely tick checks. Most people know about that. I highly recommend that, but hopefully we're doing that and we can go beyond that. But just a note on tick checks. With kids, I see a lot of tick bites like around the scalp, hairline area or in the
Right.
ears. So those are some big areas to keep an eye out for. And also thinking about tick checks, visually, but also using our fingers to notice, especially in our hair, is this a mole or is this a tick? Getting used to the contour of our bodies, and also visually, is this a freckle or is this a tick? And also, for families, you can kind of line up and help each other out. We brush our teeth hopefully twice a day or more, so we can do these tick checks, and we can just make it part of the everyday, because that's one thing people often complain about. Oh, it's time consuming, but if you kind of link it to some other nice hygiene activities, it can work out pretty well. And just thinking about those places again that ticks like to be in, moist, darker areas. So, under the armpits, under the belt, or in the groin, all these types of areas behind the knee. They can be anywhere, but they're more likely to be in those areas. So
Yeah.
that's the tick check.
Yeah. Well,
But there's so many other things. Yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, when I got bit, again, I didn't know I got bit. And again, when ticks bite you, they've got like a little anesthetic in their jaws, so you can't feel that bite. And I got bit underneath my left butt cheek, and I couldn't see it. It was someone else that saw it as I was getting ready to go to the hospital. So, like you said, it's important to understand that you can check yourself. That's great, but you probably need someone else to help you, because there's so many parts of your body that you just can't easily see. The back of your arms, the back of your legs, neck, your hairline behind your ears. So if you've got a buddy, a partner, someone else that can help do a tick check for you, that's just going to increase the possibility, if there is a tick there, that you might pick it up.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And so some other ideas, we can also, when we come in from the outdoors, we could link that tick check to that time, but we can also put our clothes in the dryer on high. So 6 for ticks, 6 minutes in the dryer on high, and that kills ticks. So that's helpful on any clothes. If you wash it, just to note, this is important, because usually we would want to wash our clothes before we put them in the dryer. So if you wash them first, unless it's on very high heat, and I have the detail of the temperature in the book, it will probably make it through the wash. And then I just think about, well, you could have some ticks then crawling around your washer, and then you have to transport that to the dryer. And then you actually need an hour to try out those clothes at least, to really kill ticks, because they love the moisture, right? And so that heat, that drying heat, will kill them, desiccate them. So that's a little tip. And then also we've talked about cedar oil. There's also something called newt ketone that's coming out that I'm very excited about. It's been like years in the making, but when that comes out, that hopefully will be quite helpful, because that is the only substance at this point that we know lasts 3 days. There was a study showing 100% repellence of ticks for 3 days.
Wow.
So yeah, better than DEET. Actually, cedar oil and DEET were actually equal. In 2022, there was a study that was really actually kind of validating to me in a way that, yes, it's a good choice to use this alternative natural option of cedar oil, because it lasts just as long as DEET, which is only 1 or 2 hours. So when you're using a repellent like that, I think it's important to note, like, it fades pretty quickly. So you need to reapply, which is, something just to keep in mind. And then that's where permethrin comes in, permethrin treatment of clothing, socks and shoes, clothing if you'd like, depending on, your activity level outside, what you're doing in their landscape, and your risk factors for getting a tick bite. So yeah, I do love recommending getting clothes treated for protection too.
Now, can you treat the clothes with the cedar oil? Or do you just spray it over the top of your clothes before
With
you
the
go outdoors?
cedar, yeah, it won't last that long, just 1
Yeah.
to 2 hours. But sure, you could spray everything, with cedar oil if you wanted. Yeah.
Well, I know there's so many companies that make, different types of essential oil products. I worry about DEET just because, again, it is a potentially toxic chemical, especially if it gets on your skin, and it gets
Absolutely.
absorbed, and particularly for children. And again, the fact that you have to reapply it potentially frequently, that's just going to accumulate over time. Where at least with the essential oil products, if it gets on your skin, it's not likely to have any serious adverse effect unless you happen to be allergic to one of those oils. It's generally, safe. So whether it gets on the clothing, gets on the skin, I generally have people, spray it over the top of their clothing, unless they're going to be wearing like short sleeve shirts and they're going to be in an area that might be a higher risk. But I think at least if it does get on the skin, we don't have to worry as much.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
even I think wearing long clothing, right? Long sleeve shirts, long pants, tuck them into your socks. Clothing is a good barrier, right, for ticks. So if you can create as much barrier between your skin and the outside world, that's just another easy thing to do, which I know it kind of sucks because if it's the summertime and it's hot and it's humid, you're like, well, I don't want to wear long clothing. Well, it's your choice, but I think it does provide that extra layer of protection against potential tick bite.
Right. And then just keeping your eye out for them, because they do crawl upward. So they'll look for whenever that next piece of skin is open. So it could be the neck,
Right.
So then just being careful with whatever is exposed. Yeah.
And ticks don't jump, right?
Right.
So you got
That
to have
is
some
true.
sort
They
of direct
crawl.
contact with, foliage brushing up against
Mhm.
you. And I also warn people, like, if they're going to go where someplace where there's overhanging trees or bushes, because I think, again, we think so much about like the lower part, our feet, our lower legs, and sometimes your arms, but we forget about our head. If you walk under a tree branch and it hits your head, that could be just as easy to get a tick as, walking barefoot through the grass.
Yeah, they do love humidity, so they're going to be closer to the ground. They're not going to be way up, in a tree and fall. People ask that, are they going to fall out of the trees on me? I mean, birds can carry them, and mice and such, so they could fall off of them if they finish their blood meal, perhaps. But yeah, they love to be in leaf litter and grass. The humidity keeps them alive. So yeah, definitely being careful in those areas. So.
Is there anything else in terms of personal protection for ticks that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, the permethrin treatment, I just love to share some facts, because sometimes it's compelling for people to make that extra change. So if you just treat your shoes and socks with permethrin, it will decrease the chances of a tick bite by 73 times.
Wow.
So that's amazing, right? And that's for when we're thinking, yes, if our feet are that barrier, right? So our shoes can be that barrier if we're just walking through the grass. Now, if we're rolling around, or we're gardening and we're kneeling and that sort of thing, that's a good time to think about, well, maybe I do want to get my whole outfit treated. And so, there was a study looking at some workers that did have full-on gear with permethrin treated clothing, and it decreases the rate of tick bites by 99%. Again, amazing, right? So I do see quite an impact from using that. But again, with permethrin, we want to be careful if we apply it to our clothes. Bring it outside, bring the clothes outside, spray them down, let it dry, and then it's safe for us to touch, and still repels the ticks. And when we do it, it lasts 6 weeks. If you wanted to send out some clothes, there's a company, Insect Shield. They're amazing. You can actually package up your clothes, send it to them, and they'll do it commercially. So it lasts 70 washes. So a
Wow.
long time. Yeah. So I love, thinking about combinations, and if this all is overwhelming to people, just choosing one thing and saying, you know what, this year we're going to do this. And, I see patients year after year, and they'll say, okay, this year we did the tick tubes and we saw a difference. You know what? Next year we're going to do the permethrin treatment of some outfits and use them when we garden. Great. Make some practical goals. That's not overwhelming, but that you can do to decrease your chances of tick bites.
So you do all these great things, you're trying to prevent it, and yet you're out and you look at your arm and you see a little tick, and
Uh,
it looks like it's embedded, and like, okay. So, my feeling is, if you see a tick on you and it's not attached yet, I think you can safely pull it off and discard it, and you probably don't have much to worry about, because once it embeds on you, it will stay on you until it's had a full blood meal, and then it falls off. They don't hang around too long after that. So, but if it's embedded, talk us through what is the proper way to remove the tick.
right. So I actually love something called the Otom tick twister. You could certainly use, just a regular tweezer. I just, in the beginning of practice, when people would come in, I just saw I mutilated them, and then that's agitating the tick, and then the tick can release more saliva that could have pathogens into your bloodstream. So, and then the mouth parts are in the skin. So I came across this tool, the Otom tick twister, and it just slides right under the tick, and then you twist it and pull up, and it's pretty amazing. It's usually the first try you get it out, maybe second try, and it's over, and it has the mouth parts with it. So I love that tool. There are certainly other types, but I would be careful. I had a patient once come in and they got a twister from someone else, and that's fine. But they showed me, they say, look, I keep trying and it's not coming off. And I tried, and the tine was just too wide. So it just
Yeah.
went right over the tick. So, the Otom was thin enough. So I said, well, let's try this one. I don't know, hopefully this always works. So I used it, and there you go. It worked. So it really grabbed that tick, the mouth parts there. So yeah, that's in my experience. So
And,
yep.
and what are maybe some things not to do?
Right. So getting the match out, getting the Vaseline out, squeezing it. Yeah, those aren't such good ideas.
Yeah, I had a patient not long ago, an older patient, and again, she found a tick and she pulled the match out, lit it and then took the
Mm.
burning match. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Like, I don't know why these old wives' tales kind of still
Uh,
perpetuate, but yeah,
uh,
don't use the burning match. Don't slather them in Vaseline. Yeah, you don't want to do anything that's going to kind of like scare the tick. So it injects more of its saliva in you and potentially more pathogens. So, tweezers, the OTOM tool is great. I've used that with patients, and be patient with it too. I know the OTOM tool is pretty quick and easy. If you're using really regular tweezers, you got to be patient with it. The thing you don't want to do is just don't yank it out. Those jaws are embedded pretty deeply, and you're just likely to rip the tick in half, and you're not going to get the head piece out. You want to try and pull the whole tick out in total if you can. So just be a little patient. Sometimes you have to just sit there and pull gently, and eventually it'll kind of let go, but it does take a little bit of time and patience.
hmm Yeah, because they're cemented in there. They use a chemical, like you said, to anesthetize us, and then also to cement themselves in there. So it can be hard to get them out.
So one of the things you talk about in your book, and I'm totally in this camp too, is okay. So let's say there is a tick there. You successfully extract the tick. Uh, what are some things that people can think about doing? I mean, the standard protocol is to treat with doxycycline. And this idea behind a single dose of doxycycline's pretty much been disproven. It suppresses the
hmm
rash. It certainly doesn't prevent getting Lyme disease at all. But we know that that's kind of the conventional approach. And I know that we have other people in the summit talking about that. But I want to hear about your approach using herbs for acute Lyme disease. And I know there's a lot of different ways to approach it, but maybe just talk a little bit about some of the herbs that are kind of your go-tos if someone has acute Lyme, or we're not sure yet. They're in that early phase where it's too early to test, but we want to help prevent this thing, getting any further than it is.
Yeah, yeah. And I opened up having time in my schedule for tick bite clinic years and years ago when I saw this because I wanted to spend the time with these folks, like right in the moment where we can really affect change, right? We don't have to wait a month or a year or 10 years, or as we know, for a long time before we really take action. And everybody has a different preference, and that's totally fine. If I were to get a tick bite, I know I would do the prophylaxis and I'd be right on it. And I know a lot of patients that would. And some other people are fine with just watching and waiting, and that's fine. But yes, I created this particular formula of herbs that can kill Lyme and other tick-borne diseases in the black-legged, the deer tick, right? So I created that formula thinking about, well, what can we do? We know the doxycycline 1 or 2 doses really isn't reliable. Maybe there's that 3-week option or different options people do with using something like doxycycline, but we know that there's the round form of Lyme, there's biofilm, there are other things to think about. There are other, there's babesiosis that could be transmitted that is not treated with doxy, right? So I was thinking, like, in totality, what are these pathogens that this deer tick can carry and transmit? And instead of waiting, until we can test or waiting for symptoms to come, let's do something immediately. So as soon as you have a tick bite, you could start depending on the tick. And in the book, I talk about, the profile of all the ticks and what pathogens they can carry. And so then I created these formulas based on what pathogens each tick carries, right? So, the main example being the black-legged deer tick.
Yeah.
So you can start right in. And so what I recommend is this prophylaxis for 3 times a day for a month after a tick bite. And then during that time, you're also watching and waiting for symptoms, of course. And if you developed a fever or rash or the symptoms of Lyme or another tick-borne disease, please contact your doctor about that. And then, I don't see it happen much, but then we would add, of course, we could, if we wanted to add, a more comprehensive protocol, if we wanted to include pharmaceutical antibiotics, for instance, or if we thought maybe it's anaplasmosis, if there's a high fever, worst headache of your life. We have a lot of anaplasmosis in Vermont. So the testing for that is accurate right in the acute phase. So we could actually test and find out. And if so, we could decide if we wanted to add 2 weeks of doxycycline. If it's more, looking like Lyme, we can't test until 4 weeks later. So we might decide, let's stick with this prophylaxis herbal, or we might decide, well, there's symptoms, so let's also add an antibiotic at this acute phase. So there's a lot of decision making, and I always include my patients in on that and every step of the way. But yeah, I think there's a lot to do, opposed to just saying, well, there's a tick bite, you're probably fine. Call if you have any symptoms.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think we're all in agreement. The sooner you get on top of it, the less likely you are to have any kind of residual long-term effects from Lyme or any of these other tick-borne illnesses. And again, I've treated, thousands of patients with herbs for acute Lyme disease. So, it doesn't have to be, antibiotics only. And like I said, it can be sometimes a combination. I think, the idea with doxycycline to me is always a little crazy, because how this became the gold standard, I'm a little confused, only that doxycycline is not a bactericidal antibiotic. It's what's called bacteriostatic. So it only stops the organism from replicating. And Lyme has an incredibly slow life cycle. It replicates every 1 to 16 days, where most bacteria replicates every 10 to 20 minutes. So if you only take 2 weeks of doxycycline, you may have only gone through one replication phase of the Lyme organism, and that's not very much. So it's still really dependent on your immune system's innate ability to fight infection. So if you're someone who's immune compromised in any way, for whether it's genetic, medication, or otherwise, your natural ability to fight the infection may be diminished, and that antibiotic isn't really getting rid of the bug. It's only kind of keeping it at bay. Where, like you mentioned with herbs, we've got evidence that, unlike doxycycline, it only kills Lyme when it's in its uncoiled spirochete form. If it goes into the round body or cyst form, the herbs actually kill it even in that form. So I would almost argue that herbs are more effective than antibiotics in so many cases, at least with regards to Lyme. And so I just want people to understand that you don't necessarily have to take antibiotics. I mean, I think that's a case where antibiotics are very appropriate. And if that's your comfort level, then great. But again, there are so many different herbs that can be very effective in those early stages of Lyme and tick-borne illness that, you may not necessarily have to get to a point where you take antibiotics. Some people I work with are extremely sensitive to antibiotics, or they've just spent so many months and years repairing their gut. The last thing they want to do is compromise that by taking an antibiotic. And
Right.
certainly the herbs are less damaging, I guess we could say, to the gut microbiome. What are some of the specific herbs that you've got included in your formula?
Yeah, so I use Japanese knotweed, cat's claw, Petunia, and cryptolepis. And that's what the black-legged deer tick bite formula is made of right now. And so in thinking about creating that, I was thinking about the pathogens, of course, like I said, but then also, and it's amazing, right? So 3 out of the 4 were recently studied at Johns Hopkins, and it's just very validating. You and I have been doing this a long time, you longer than me. And, we have the experience in the office with the patients seeing, yes, herbs work, but it's nice to have that validation. And I do appreciate research, certainly, and I'm guided by that in certain ways. But also just to validate our experience and then to have found out, well, gee, yes. So it validates the formula that I'm using. But yeah, Japanese knotweed is incredible. It also will give you support for inflammation. It's an immune modulator. It gives you neurological support. So just when we think of symptoms that you could get from Lyme disease, right, supporting these systems, not just killing, right, doing more than that. We need the antimicrobial part, but then also supporting all of the systems that need support during that time. That's a winner for sure. And then, the cat's claw also has those anti-inflammatory properties, and the list goes on with all the actions that these herbs have.
Well, again, that's the beauty of herbs, is that, they've got so many different constituents in it that they don't really just do one thing. And the fact that so many herbs we use, like I said, they're antimicrobial, they're inflammatory, they support the immune system, they promote better circulation. They just do so many different things. So we can really mix and match these different herbs to accomplish different goals. I created a formula with allergy research called phytotic defense. And again, there's a lot of
Mm.
overlap with what you've used. My formula's got the cat's claw in it, it's got hatunia in it. I added artemisia, I added cordyceps, I added lion's mane, I added coptis. But again, all these herbs, they work in different ways, but they're still covering the bases of dealing with Lyme and these other tick-borne illnesses. And again, they work really, really well. So again, I just want to impress on people tuning in today that you've got options. And if you're working with a medical doctor, they may or may not be well versed in herbs. Dr. Chesni and I are both naturopathic doctors, so herbs are a part of our medical training, and we're very experienced in it. So you may have to seek out a functional medicine doctor, a naturopathic doctor trained in herbal medicine if that's a route you want to go. But just to know that there are options out there for that acute phase. And again, if the time comes, you're now past that tick bite, you've done testing on yourself, and if you've got antibodies, you've had exposure, so kind of depending on where you are at that point, my experience, again, if we're able to get this early, I want to make sure I can say this correctly. I don't know that I've ever had to give an antibiotic after that 4 to 6 weeks of being on herbs because it wasn't working.
Mm.
Off the top of my head, I can't say that I have. I mean, I have had patients where we've given them antibiotics. Sometimes we do antibiotics and herbs, but for people who've just been on herbs in acute phase, I don't know that I've had to use antibiotics. So my experience has been that, again, they do what we want it to do. And again, I think if we can hit that early on, we're preventing this long potential nightmare of chronic Lyme. So I think that the general rule in our world is treat until proven otherwise. And whether that's with antibiotics or herbs, but get something on board. And, I do recommend for patients to save the tick if they can pull it off, send it to someplace like tickreport.com, get tested. It's not perfect, but at least it gives us more information to make our decisions on treatment. Because if it comes back and we know that tick carries Lyme or Bartonella or Babesia or Anaplasma, okay, well, we may want to stay with this treatment longer, or maybe I want to change either the herbs or the antibiotics based on now we know specifically what you've been exposed to. So again, it just gives us more information to make those decisions.
Absolutely. Yes, I highly recommend tick testing. It can be so helpful.
So I want to shift gears just a little bit in sort of the closing part of our talk and talk a little bit about this thing called alpha-gal syndrome. It's fortunately a fairly not common, I won't say rare, but it's becoming more common. But it's this thing that after you get bit by certain types of ticks, you become highly allergic to meat products. So can you tell us a little bit about what this whole alpha-gal thing's about?
Sure. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I don't come across it much, but in the world of tick-borne disease, we're usually thinking of pathogens, infections, and this is not one, right? And it's actually from the saliva of a Lone Star tick. So it's just this. So alpha-gal is galactose alpha 1,3 galactose. It's a sugar molecule, and so it can be transmitted through that Lone Star tick saliva. So yeah, it's just kind of different, right? But it can create this for some people, for a small amount of people, but still it can be life altering because it can create this immediate hypersensitivity reaction with IgE. And so you can get scary things like anaphylaxis. You could go to that extreme, or you could have things like vomiting and abdominal discomfort, itchy rash, hives, trouble breathing, going into throat closing, lips or mouth swelling, anaphylaxis kind of an experience. And even things like it can affect your blood pressure, low blood pressure, or fainting. Thinking about that, that's not usually the profile of symptoms that I see in my typical Lyme patient, right? So it is very different. So it's helpful to kind of clarify, what's what for people. But there is a test for it, so that's helpful. So it's alpha-gal IgE, a blood test, simple, Quest, LabCorp, or probably any hospital lab, easy to get. to see, if somebody is having those symptoms and you're ruling out other things, of course, what else comes to mind? Food allergies, mast cell activation syndrome, things like this. But this might be on the list now, also with tick bite history or someone that has a tick-borne disease, could this be going on?
So the alpha gal's found, so it's beef, it's pork. Are there other food products that have the alpha gal protein or
Yeah,
sugar?
so it's all mammal meat except not human or primate or ape. So just thinking of, pork, beef, venison, rabbit. I mean, the list goes on really, for meats. And it can even come up, like some people, like I think of barbecue, the typical like barbecue foods.
Yeah.
And so it can come up. Some people are sensitive to having it airborne. They can be affected. But yeah, anyway, just a fun tip, unfortunately.
Well, and where do the Lone Star ticks typically live?
Yeah, so as it might sound, definitely in Texas, and then it's sort of definitely east of the Rockies, and then more southern United States. But they are finding their way up. I have not had a patient bring in a Lone Star tick yet in Vermont, but apparently they are in Vermont and New Hampshire, which is a large portion of my patient population. I have had patients get a tick bite from a Lone Star tick in New York. So, it's coming up north as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I said I've only seen a handful of cases in my own practice. It's kind of an odd thing, and again, it happens overnight. All of a sudden, people eat these meat products, and they have often the cases I've seen have had like severe anaphylactic reactions that were very serious and very dangerous, and they all ended up in the ER with really bad symptoms. And again, kind of perplexing. And of course, it's so easy to write off that it's just due to some other thing, because there's a lot of things that can cause anaphylaxis. But it's because beef as a whole, I think beef specifically, because beef by itself is not a common food allergy.
Mhm.
We see so many things that can cause anaphylaxis. Usually, I think of like peanuts and tree nuts, and beef as a whole is relatively low on the list. So when I hear about anaphylaxis to, I said, meat products, the first thing I would think about testing for is this alpha gal to see if that's part of the problem. For people who might have this, are there any solutions? Are there any possible treatments for it?
It's really just avoiding the foods. Yeah, and over time, people get better, it seems. And everybody seems different, like the severity of the reaction or the number of foods that they're affected by. And also the confusing thing is it can change a little bit over time. So yeah, it's a little hard to pin down sometimes for people. And just another, note is that thinking of other items in one's life that can have alpha gal, like body products or gelatin, right? So gelatin is in capsules of supplements.
Right.
Carrageenan, that's also actually has alpha gal, and that's in a lot of foods. So yeah, if you're on, say, a bovine or porcine, kind of like a thyroid supplement or medication, these are also going to have alpha gal that you could react to. So I think for some people it's navigating through seeing, what is it that they're reacting to and trying to really narrow that down and then avoid until they get better. But yeah, what have you seen? Have you seen any other helpful remedies or anything?
Yeah, we've actually been doing low dose allergy therapy in our practice for people with alpha gal. Again, this is just a handful of people, but
Mhm.
so far it seems to help.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
so we'll recheck their blood
Great.
levels. We'll see their blood levels drop over time. Now, again, it's hard to say, would that naturally have happened over time anyway? Again, I haven't seen 50 alpha gal patients to say for sure, but we do see their blood levels drop, telling me that they're probably less sensitive. Obviously, they're avoiding the foods so they don't trigger the reaction while we're trying to treat it. But this is a potential option for people who do develop the sensitivity as a way to kind of desensitize them against that. And again, it just takes a little bit of time, but for something that can be that serious and life threatening, and of course, we usually have people carry an EpiPen on hand because you just never know where you're going to be exposed until you can get to a point where you feel confident that allergy is under better control. But low dose allergy therapy, there's a lot of environmental medicine doctors out there that do this treatment. And so for someone who has this might be a potential option as well.
Great, great.
Well, Alexis, this has been a great discussion. It's so important that we talk about prevention because, again, anything we can do to help keep from getting to that point of having, either acute or chronic Lyme is just so critically important. And I think the piece about alpha gal is just really interesting. Again, it doesn't affect that many people, but for those who do, it can be really devastating. And just having that awareness that it is possible, at least with those Lone Star tick bites. I know people are going to want to pick up a copy of your book. I mentioned it, Preventing Lyme and Other Tick-Borne Diseases. Just a great resource. And I know you walk people through more details about things you can do in and around your home and personal care to prevent getting a tick. If people want to connect with you, what's the best way people to find you?
Yeah, my website would be great. dralexischesney.com.
Great. Well, again, I appreciate you being part of the summit, sharing your time with us. And I know people will be excited to connect with you. So again, I'm just really appreciative that you've spent some time with us on the summit. So thank you again.
Thank you. This was wonderful. It was great talking about prevention, one of our naturopathic principles that we share.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.